Hey my dear listener, before we start, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Comment down where are you from and what's your time right now. Let's jump into the video. Story 1. Helike, the Greek city the sea took back. You would have liked Helike if you had visited it in the winter of 374 BCE. It was not flashy like Athens, not wealthy in the way Corinth liked to announce itself, but it was dependable, a place of routines, a city that expected tomorrow to arrive more or less the same as today. Helike sat on the southern shore of the Gulf of Corinth, in a low, fertile plain where rivers wandered lazily toward the sea. The land was good here. Wheat grew easily. Vines were predictable. Olives took their time but rewarded patience. If you were a farmer, Helike made sense. If you were a trader moving goods along the Gulf, Helike was convenient. If you were a citizen, the city gave you the quiet confidence that comes from stability rather than ambition. Most days followed patterns so familiar that they barely registered as history at all. You woke to the sound of carts creaking over packed earth roads. Someone nearby always seemed to be repairing a roof tile or mending a wall. In the distance, the sea moved in its usual way, an unremarkable rhythm that had never betrayed anyone's trust. Fishermen pushed boats out before dawn, expecting to return by mid-morning with modest catches. Children learned letters, not because they would become philosophers, but because basic literacy was increasingly practical. Priests tended to shrines that had stood longer than anyone could remember. Helike was especially proud of one thing: its devotion to Poseidon. The god of the sea and earthquakes held a prominent place in the city's identity. His temple stood near the center of town, solid and respected. Travelers remarked on it. Coins from Helike bore his image. Festivals were held in his honor. If you asked a citizen what protected their city, they would likely mention Poseidon before mentioning walls or soldiers. This mattered because Helike lived with the ground. The Peloponnese sits along fault lines, though no one used that language yet. Earthquakes were familiar, not shocking. The earth shuddered from time to time, walls cracked, jars fell from shelves. People rebuilt. They always rebuilt. Experience taught that the ground could be trusted again once it finished its brief tantrum. Helike had endured tremors before. Nothing catastrophic. Enough to be inconvenient, never enough to rewrite the future. By the late 4th century BCE, Helike was also a political center. It led the Achaean League, a loose federation of city-states along the northern Peloponnese. This brought meetings, visitors, documents, and arguments. It also brought a sense of importance that did not feel fragile. Helike wasn't worried about conquest or collapse. It was worried about trade agreements, boundary disputes, and the kind of problems that assume continuity. On the night it vanished, people went to sleep thinking about ordinary things. Some worried about debts, some worried about weather, some worried about aging parents or disobedient children. A few might have worried about omens. There were always those who noticed strange animal behavior or uneasy dreams, but most people ignored such things. Experience suggested that tomorrow would come, and that worry was rarely rewarded. Ancient sources tell us that strange signs preceded Helike's destruction. Fish reportedly abandoned the shoreline days before. Animals behaved erratically. The sea behaved oddly, withdrawing farther than usual. But these reports were written later by people who already knew the ending. At the time, such things were easy to dismiss. Fishermen noticed changes in fish patterns all the time. Animals were unpredictable by nature. The sea did strange things without explanation. Nothing about that evening required panic. Then, sometime during the night, the earth moved in a way it had not before. The earthquake was severe, violent enough to flatten buildings, split the ground, and wake everyone at once. You would not have had time to understand what was happening. Roofs collapsed, walls fell inward, streets twisted. People ran, but there was nowhere safe to run to. The darkness was total. Dust filled the air. Screams did not travel far over the noise of stone tearing itself apart. And then came the water. Helike's position near the coast, once a blessing, became a sentence. The quake caused the land to subside. The sea rushed in, not as a gentle flood but as a force that erased boundaries. What structures remained standing after the shaking were undone by water. Fields disappeared. Roads vanished. The harbor ceased to exist as a concept. By morning, Helike was gone. Not damaged, not abandoned, gone. Where a city had stood was now a lagoon. The sea covered streets, homes, temples, and bodies. Survivors, if any, managed to reach higher ground, looked down on water where memory insisted there should be land. Nothing in their experience prepared them for this outcome. Cities burned. Cities were sacked. Cities declined. But cities did not usually disappear beneath the sea overnight. News traveled quickly. Sailors passing through the Gulf reported submerged ruins visible beneath shallow water. Bronze statues could be seen below the surface. Columns stood like drowned trees. Boats avoided the area out of fear, not only of wreckage but of divine anger. To many Greeks, the destruction of Helike was not a geological event. It was punishment. Poseidon, they said, had reclaimed what was his. The story spread because it was useful. Philosophers referenced it when discussing divine justice. Moralists used it as a warning against hubris. Helike became an example, a cautionary tale stripped of its daily human texture. The fishermen, farmers, children, and clerks faded into abstraction. What mattered was the message. And yet, even as Helike entered legend, something strange happened. It was not rebuilt, and it was not properly remembered. Other cities destroyed by catastrophe often rose again nearby. Survivors returned. Names persisted. But Helike remained underwater. The Achaean League shifted its center. Life reorganized itself without much ceremony. Within a few generations, Helike was something people spoke about vaguely, as a place that used to be somewhere near there. You can feel the unsettling quiet in that outcome. A city that had planned for the future did not get one. No gradual decline, no long goodbye. One night drew a line through everything. And yet, history did not linger. There were no epic poems dedicated to Helike, no detailed survivor accounts passed down, no grand rebuilding effort to memorialize the loss. Even ancient historians seemed oddly restrained. Strabo mentions Helike briefly. Pausanias describes seeing its ruins beneath the water centuries later. Aristotle references it when discussing earthquakes. None dwell on the human cost. None slow down to consider the small routines that ended without warning. It is as if Helike was too ordinary to mourn for long. And maybe that is why its story matters. When archaeologists began searching for Helike in the modern era, they faced skepticism. For a long time, the city was treated as semi-mythical, a morality tale exaggerated over time. After all, cities do not simply sink into the sea and vanish, or so it seemed. But the evidence accumulated slowly, methodically, in a way Helike itself would have appreciated. Sediment layers, submerged walls, pottery fragments, proof that the lagoon covered not legend but streets. Still, even with confirmation, Helike does not hold the public imagination the way Pompeii does. There are no frozen bodies, no dramatic ash casts. Water is quieter than fire. It erases without spectacle. If you stand near the site today, nothing announces what happened. The land looks peaceful. Reeds grow. Birds nest. Farmers work nearby fields. You could pass through without knowing you were walking beside the grave of a city that once led a league of its peers. That silence raises a question that lingers longer than the event itself. If a functioning city can disappear overnight and be absorbed into history, with barely a pause, how many other places like Helike have vanished without even leaving a name behind? When you wake the morning after Helike is gone, the first challenge is not grief. It is orientation. The landscape no longer matches memory. Paths that once led somewhere now stop at water. Familiar reference points, trees, shrines, boundary stones are missing. Even the horizon looks wrong because the land itself has shifted. Before you can mourn neighbors or family, you must solve a simpler, more disturbing problem. Where are you? Survivors, those few who happened to be outside the city, or who reached higher ground in time, did not have a framework for this kind of loss. Greek culture understood destruction, but it usually came with witnesses, enemies, or causes that could be named. He offered none of those comforts. There was no army to blame, no tyrant to curse, no warning that could be clearly identified in hindsight. Only absence. The immediate practical response was muted, not heroic. No grand rescue efforts followed. Boats could not navigate safely over the submerged ruins. The water was shallow in places, deceptive in others. Debris floated unpredictably. Bodies were likely unrecoverable. Even if you wanted to search, there was nothing to search through. The city had become a surface. So people did what people usually do after disasters. They moved on. Nearby settlements absorbed refugees. Kinship networks stretched thin but held. Land was redistributed where possible. The Achaean League continued meeting, just not in Helike. Administrative records were updated. Decisions were made. Life reorganized itself around the absence as efficiently as possible. This efficiency is unsettling if you linger on it. Helike had been important enough to mint coins, lead alliances, and host festivals. Yet within a short time, it functioned mainly as a reference point where Helike used to be. Its political role vanished with it. The League did not pause for long reflection. There were other concerns, rivalries, harvests, threats that required attention. History rarely has the patience for grief. As decades passed, the physical remains of Helike continued to sink. Sediment from rivers slowly covered what the earthquake and sea had not already claimed. What had once been visible beneath clear water became murky, then invisible. Fishermen avoided the area less out of fear and more out of practicality. Nets caught on submerged stone. Boats scraped unexpectedly. Stories filled the gap left by fading evidence. Helike became a moral example. The details shifted depending on who was telling the story. Some claimed the city had offended Poseidon by mistreating his priests. Others said Helike had refused sanctuary to Ionian refugees and was punished for its lack of hospitality. These variations tell you more about the anxieties of later Greeks than about Helike itself. What stayed constant was the lesson: stability could not be assumed. Philosophers found Helike useful. Aristotle referenced the event when discussing natural causes and the relationship between land and sea. To him, Helike was evidence that geography was not fixed. Coastlines moved. Land rose and fell. The earth was active, not static. This was an important idea, but even here, Helike served as data, not as a human tragedy. Pausanias, writing centuries later, claimed that parts of Helike could still be seen underwater, including a bronze statue of Poseidon standing upright beneath the waves. Whether this was true or symbolic hardly mattered. The image stuck, the god calmly occupying the space where his city once stood. That image likely helped Helike persist in cultural memory longer than it otherwise would have. But memory is not the same as presence. No one rebuilt Helike. The land was considered unstable, possibly cursed, certainly unreliable. New settlements appeared elsewhere on higher ground, farther from the sea. Over time, even the exact location of Helike became uncertain. Ancient authors disagreed. Maps contradicted one another. By the Roman period, Helike was already half lost again, this time to confusion rather than catastrophe. You can sense how easily this happens. When a place disappears completely, it leaves behind no daily reminders, no ruins to walk through, no walls to repair. Without physical anchors, memory drifts, stories shorten, details blur. Eventually, what remains is a name and a vague sense that something important once happened there. For centuries, Helike existed in this in-between state, too well-attested to be dismissed as myth, too poorly preserved to be fully trusted as history. Modern archaeology did not rush to correct this. Unlike Pompeii, he offered no dramatic promise. It was underwater, buried beneath sediment, and complicated by shifting coastlines. Excavation required patience, funding, and a willingness to accept modest results. For a long time, researchers focused elsewhere on places that rewarded effort with visible spectacle. He waited. In the late 20th century, systematic surveys began in earnest. Geologists and archaeologists worked together, not searching for statues or temples at first, but for layers of disruption. They looked for signs of sudden subsidence, marine sediment inland, and broken habitation layers that matched the historical date. Slowly, the picture sharpened. What they found confirmed ancient accounts with uncomfortable precision. There was evidence of a powerful earthquake. There were signs of rapid flooding. There were remains of structures where water should not have been. He had not drifted into legend through exaggeration. If anything, the ancient writers had understated how complete the destruction was. Yet even this rediscovery was quiet. There was no single triumphant moment, no grand unveiling, just reports, papers, cautious conclusions. He re-entered academic conversation without fanfare. The broader public barely noticed. That too fits the story. He challenges the way history is usually told. It resists drama. There is no villain, no hero, no satisfying arc. Just a system, geological, social, political, that failed suddenly and moved on without ceremony. If you imagine yourself standing on the shore of the lagoon in the years after the disaster, the silence would be the most striking feature. No rebuilding noise, no arguments about plans, no commemorative monuments, just water, reeds, and the sense that something had been removed from the world without leaving instructions. This kind of disappearance forces an uncomfortable question. How much of history depends not on importance, but on survivability? How many cities mattered deeply to the people who lived there, only to be erased so completely that later generations had little reason to care? He was not forgotten because it was insignificant. It was forgotten because nothing remained to insist on remembrance. And beneath that realization lies another, quieter thought, one that ancient Greeks may not have articulated, but certainly felt. If he could vanish without warning, and if its loss could be absorbed so efficiently, what did that say about the permanence of any city, any institution, any carefully maintained sense of order? That question did not get answered right away. It lingered, unresolved, like the submerged streets themselves, present, but inaccessible. If you wait long enough after a disaster, something predictable happens. Life grows over it. The lagoon where he once stood did not remain a raw wound in the landscape. Reeds took hold along the edges. Birds learned the new patterns of shallow water. Sediment continued to settle, smoothing what had once been jagged destruction into something deceptively calm. The earth, indifferent to memory, finished its work. For the people living nearby generations later, he was not a recent loss. It was a story their grandparents might have heard from their grandparents. A thing that happened long ago, before current boundaries, before current obligations. The urgency faded, replaced by familiarity with the new normal. This is how absence becomes background. The Greeks did not develop a culture of large-scale disaster memorials. There were no plaques to mark vanished cities, no preserved ruins fenced off for contemplation. The past was something you encountered when it intersected with the present through active temples, living traditions, and functional structures. He offered none of these. And so it slipped further away. Yet its influence did not disappear entirely. It changed shape. He quietly contributed to a growing awareness that the world was unstable in ways that politics and piety could not fully control. Earthquakes became subjects of more serious inquiry. Coastlines were understood to shift. The idea that land and sea were in constant negotiation gained traction among thinkers who paid attention to patterns rather than myths. In this sense, He helped move Greek thought slightly, subtly toward a more observational understanding of nature. But these developments were incremental, and he rarely received explicit credit. It functioned more like an undercurrent than a landmark. By the time Rome dominated the Mediterranean, he was already ancient history. Roman writers referenced it occasionally, usually as an illustration rather than an event. The lagoon remained. The ruins, if still there, were invisible beneath layers of mud and water. The precise location was debated, but the debate itself was academic. Rome had its own disasters to document. What he demonstrates, more clearly the farther you move from it in time, is how history prioritizes continuity over completeness. Events that interrupt daily life briefly but allow recovery tend to dominate narratives. Wars end. Cities rebuild. Dynasties fall, but institutions adapt. These stories have motion. He had no motion after its end. It did not rebuild. It did not transform. It simply stopped. That finality makes it difficult to integrate into a story that prefers cause and effect, rise and fall. He offers only cause and erasure. And erasure, while common in human experience, is strangely hard to narrate. Modern archaeology has given He a partial afterlife, but even now the recovery is limited. Excavation beneath waterlogged sediment is slow and expensive. What has been uncovered so far consists mostly of fragments, walls without rooms, objects without context, patterns without people. These fragments confirm that He existed as described. They do not bring back the texture of daily life. You will not find detailed inventories of homes or written records of individual families. You will not find letters describing the night of the earthquake or diaries reflecting on survival. Those materials require survival, continuity, and intentional preservation. He provided none of these. And so, to understand He you are forced to imagine the ordinary. You imagine someone repairing a fishing net earlier that evening, assuming they would finish it the next day. You imagine grain stored for a future that never arrived. You imagine disputes left unresolved because there was no one left to resolve them. These are not dramatic images, but they are the most accurate. He reminds you that history is not made only of turning points recognized as such. It is also made of interruptions that leave no time to register their importance. In modern terms, He feels uncomfortably relevant. Coastal cities today sit on fault lines and floodplains. Engineering has improved. Monitoring systems exist. But the basic relationship between human settlement and unstable land has not changed. We still build where trade is easy and soil is fertile, often knowing the risks and assuming they will not materialize during our lifetime. He's residents were not careless. They were experienced. They had lived with earthquakes before. They honored the God associated with their environment. They did everything that made sense within their understanding of the world. It was not enough. This is perhaps the most sobering lesson He offers. Resilience does not guarantee survival. Preparation does not always produce warning. And significance does not ensure remembrance. If He had been a louder city, more violent in its end, more dramatic in its remains, it might occupy a larger space in popular history. Instead, it teaches quietly, through absence. When you walk through museums filled with artifacts from ancient Greece, you are seeing the curated survivors of time. He's contributions lie mostly beneath water and silt, uncollected, unseen. They exist as negative space in the historical record. And yet, that negative space matters. It reminds you that for every well-documented ruin, there are places where life ended without leaving a usable trace. Cities whose stories can only be inferred. People whose lives matter deeply to them and almost not at all to posterity. He is not unique in this. It is simply one of the few cases where disappearance was so complete and so sudden that even ancient historians paused long enough to mention it. That pause is all it has. If you listen closely, Helike does not ask to be remembered as a tragedy or a lesson or a warning. It offers something quieter. It asks you to consider how much of history depends on endurance rather than importance, and how much of human effort vanishes without ever becoming a story. And once you accept that, it becomes harder to assume that what survives is what mattered most. Helike vanished overnight. History noticed briefly, then it moved on. The question that lingers is not why Helike disappeared, but how easily the world adjusted to its absence, and whether that adjustment is still happening all around you, in places not yet submerged, not yet silent, but just as vulnerable. Story 2. The Silent Collapse of Great Zimbabwe. If you approach Great Zimbabwe slowly on foot, as most people once did, the first thing you notice is not its size. It is its patience. The stone walls rise from the landscape without urgency, following the contours of the land rather than forcing it into submission. They do not announce themselves from far away. There is no single dramatic skyline, no towering monument visible for miles. Instead, the city reveals itself in stages, as if it expects you to take your time. This was intentional. Great Zimbabwe was never meant to intimidate strangers through spectacle alone. It was meant to endure, and for centuries it did. Located on a high plateau in what is now southeastern Zimbabwe, the city sat at the center of a web of trade routes that stretched farther than its builders could see. Gold from nearby rivers, ivory from inland forests, cattle raised on surrounding grasslands. These goods moved outward, eventually reaching the Swahili coast, then across the Indian Ocean to Arabia, India, and beyond. But if you lived in Great Zimbabwe during its height, sometime between the 11th and 14th centuries, you did not experience this global reach as something abstract. You experienced it as routine. You saw foreign beads worked into local jewelry. You heard stories of distant ports from traders who stayed only briefly. You handled cloth that was not woven locally. These objects were rare but not mysterious. They were evidence that your city mattered. The name Zimbabwe comes from a Shona phrase often translated as houses of stone. This was not poetic exaggeration. The city's defining feature was its dry stone architecture, massive walls built without mortar, fitted so precisely that they have stood for centuries. Some walls reached over 10 meters high and several meters thick. They curved gracefully, forming enclosures whose purpose was partly practical, partly symbolic. The Great Enclosure, the largest single structure, dominates the site even today. Its walls form a vast oval, enclosing space that was clearly important, though its exact function remains debated. You would not have known, standing there, that future scholars would argue over what these spaces meant. To you, they were simply there, woven into the rhythms of daily life. Great Zimbabwe was not a city of everyone. It was a center of power. Most people lived in surrounding settlements, huts made of daga, mud, and thatch, rebuilt regularly as materials wore out. The stone complexes likely housed elites, ritual spaces, or administrative centers. Power here was visible but not flamboyant. The stone walls did not depict scenes or inscriptions. They did not explain themselves. They assumed continuity. Life in and around Great Zimbabwe followed patterns shaped by environment and custom. Cattle were central not just economically, but socially. Herd size signaled status. Ownership determined marriage prospects, alliances, and authority. Fields were cultivated carefully, with an understanding of rainfall that came from generations of observation. This was not a fragile system. It had adapted to the plateau's conditions over a long time. And that is what makes the city's eventual abandonment so difficult to explain in simple terms. There is no record of invasion, no layer of ash suggesting widespread fire, no mass graves pointing to sudden catastrophe. Unlike Great Zimbabwe did not vanish overnight. It emptied. At some point in the 15th century, people began leaving, not all at once, not in panic, gradually, steadily, until the stone walls stood over spaces no longer actively used. Grass grew where feet once passed daily, roofs collapsed, paths faded, and history barely noticed. Part of the reason lies in how African history was recorded, or rather, how it was not. Great Zimbabwe's builders left no written chronicles that survived. Oral traditions persisted, but they shifted with time and place. When Portuguese traders encountered the ruins centuries later, the city had already been abandoned long enough to invite speculation. Those speculations were rarely generous. European visitors struggled to accept that such architecture could be the work of local African societies. They proposed foreign builders, Phoenicians, Arabs, even biblical figures. These theories said more about colonial assumptions than about the ruins themselves. For a long time, the true history of Great Zimbabwe was obscured not by silence, but by refusal to listen. Yet even once scholars accepted its local origins, the question remained: why did it decline? From the inside, the decline would not have felt dramatic. You might have noticed that water sources were less reliable than before, or that nearby grazing lands were overused. Perhaps trade routes shifted subtly, favoring other centers. Perhaps political authority fractured, and elites relocated to establish new power bases elsewhere. None of these changes require collapse. They require adaptation. And adaptation often looks, in hindsight, like disappearance. Great Zimbabwe's strength, its durability, may have contributed to its quiet end. The city was not dependent on conquest or spectacle. It did not need to defend itself constantly. Its power came from networks, trade, cattle, belief, lineage. When those networks shifted, the stone remained, but the reason to inhabit it did not. Archaeological evidence suggests environmental pressure played a role. Population growth may have strained local resources. Deforestation for fuel and construction could have affected water retention. Overgrazing might have reduced soil quality. These are slow problems, the kind that do not announce themselves until they are already entrenched. If you lived there at the time, you might not have framed these changes as reasons to leave. You might have simply noticed that another place north or west offered better conditions. So you moved, and others followed. This is not a story of failure. It is a story of choice. And that is what makes it difficult to narrate. History prefers moments, dates, events you can point to and say, this is when it happened. Great Zimbabwe offers none of that. Its end was a process stretched across decades, perhaps generations. By the time the last residents left, there may have been no ceremony, no declaration that the city was finished. It simply ceased to be useful as a center. The stone walls did not care. They stayed. Centuries later, when outsiders encountered the ruins, they encountered endurance without context, walls without voices, structures without explanations. And because there was no dramatic ending to latch onto, the city slipped into a different kind of obscurity. Not forgotten exactly, misunderstood. Even today, standing among the ruins, you are struck by how deliberate everything feels. The walls curve inward slightly, creating a sense of enclosure. Narrow passages control movement. Sightlines suggest planning. This was not accidental architecture. It reflects authority, intention, and confidence. Which raises an unsettling question. If a city so carefully built, so well integrated into its environment and economy, could fade away without violence or catastrophe, what does that say about permanence itself? Great Zimbabwe was not destroyed, it was outgrown. And somewhere between those two facts lies the beginning of its story's quiet disappearance, a disappearance that asks you to pay attention not to endings, but to the slow shifts that make endings unnecessary. If you had lived near Great Zimbabwe during its final decades as a populated center, you might not have noticed that you were witnessing the end of something. That is the first difficulty in understanding its decline. There was no single year when people announced they were leaving, no walls torn down in anger, no invaders marching through the stone passages. Instead, there was a gradual thinning, fewer voices in the enclosures, fewer cattle in familiar kraals, fewer rituals performed in places where they had once been routine. From the inside, this would have felt less like collapse and more like redistribution. Power in southern Africa during this period was not fixed to one capital in the way later states would be. Authority traveled with people, cattle, and spiritual legitimacy. When conditions changed, leaders did not cling to stone for its own sake. They moved, bringing followers with them. This mattered. Great Zimbabwe's stone walls were impressive, but they were not the source of power. They were expressions of it. When the balance of resources and relationships shifted, the walls could remain standing while authority quietly relocated elsewhere. Archaeological evidence suggests that new centers such as Kami and later Mutapa rose in importance after Great Zimbabwe's decline. These were not rebellions against the old city. They were continuations, adapted to new circumstances. The people did not vanish. They reorganized. If you track the material culture, pottery styles, metallurgy techniques, settlement patterns, you see continuity rather than rupture. The story is not one of disappearance, but of migration. And yet, from a distance, it looks like abandonment. Great Zimbabwe's economy depended on long-distance trade, particularly in gold and ivory. These networks were sensitive to shifts far beyond the plateau. Changes in demand along the Swahili coast, political developments in the Indian Ocean world, or the rise of competing inland centers could all subtly reroute trade. You would not see these changes immediately. They would show up as fewer caravans, less foreign material arriving, slower accumulation of prestige goods. Over time, the city's role as a hub would weaken. At the same time, environmental pressures likely compounded the issue. The plateau could support large populations, but not indefinitely without careful management. Trees were cut for fuel and construction. Cattle grazed heavily. Soil erosion may have increased. Rainfall patterns could fluctuate over decades, not dramatically enough to cause famine, but enough to encourage movement. In societies accustomed to mobility, movement was not failure. It was strategy. This is an important point to sit with. Modern narratives often treat abandonment as defeat. A city left behind is assumed to be a city that lost. But for Great Zimbabwe's people, leaving may have been the most rational choice, available, an expression of resilience rather than collapse. The stone walls, however, complicate that interpretation. Because they endured, they created the impression of a civilization that stopped abruptly. Later observers saw permanence without people and assumed something had gone wrong. They looked for catastrophe, because that is what ruins usually imply in familiar historical frameworks. But Great Zimbabwe resists that expectation. There is no evidence of widespread violence at the site, no burned layers, no weapons embedded in walls. The silence is not the silence after destruction, it is the silence after relocation. That subtlety made it difficult for outsiders to interpret, especially those arriving centuries later with preconceived ideas about Africa's past. When Portuguese traders reached the region in the 16th century, Great Zimbabwe was already long uninhabited as a major center. The ruins inspired awe and confusion. The visitors recorded local traditions that associated the site with ancestral rulers, but they also imposed their own explanations. They could not or would not accept that African societies had built such structures independently. This refusal mattered for a long time. For centuries, Great Zimbabwe's story was distorted by external narratives that treated it as an anomaly requiring foreign origin. This did more than misattribute credit. It delayed serious investigation into how and why the city functioned as it did. Only in the 20th century did archaeology firmly establish Great Zimbabwe as the product of local Shona-speaking societies, built over generations with techniques refined through experience rather than imported suddenly from elsewhere. By then, the silence had done its work. Without written records from the builders themselves, interpretation relied heavily on material evidence. And material evidence tells you how people lived, but rarely why they made certain decisions. You can see that people left. You cannot easily see their reasoning. That gap invites projection. Some scholars emphasized environmental collapse, others focused on political fragmentation. Still others pointed to economic shifts. None of these explanations are mutually exclusive. More likely, they work together, slowly nudging people away from a place that no longer offered enough advantage to justify staying. What remains striking is how orderly this process appears to have been. There are no signs of hasty evacuation. Valuable objects were not widely left behind. Structures were not dismantled violently. The city was allowed to become quiet. If you imagine the final phase, it might look like this. A family decides to move toward a newer center where their kin have settled. They dismantle what can be reused. They leave behind stone walls because stone cannot travel. Someone else leaves the next year. Then another. Eventually, maintenance stops. Grass grows in the courtyards. Animals pass through spaces once restricted. At no point does anyone say, "This city is finished." That declaration is made only later, by those looking back. This kind of ending is harder to remember because it lacks drama. It does not offer a lesson that fits neatly into a moral framework. There is no obvious mistake to warn against, no enemy to condemn. Instead, Great Zimbabwe suggests that even successful systems have lifespans not because they fail, but because conditions change. And here lies the uncomfortable parallel to Helike. Helike vanished suddenly, erased by forces beyond human control. Great Zimbabwe faded slowly, shaped by decisions made in response to gradual pressures. One disaster was violent and immediate. The other was quiet and rational. Both ended the same way, with empty spaces that history struggled to explain. The difference is that Helike's destruction demanded attention, even if briefly. Great Zimbabwe's decline did not. It was too calm, too reasonable, too lacking in spectacle to interrupt larger narratives. Which raises another question worth holding onto. If a city can lose its importance without suffering obvious catastrophe, if it can be left behind rather than destroyed, how many other centers have slipped out of history, simply because their endings were too sensible to record? Great Zimbabwe's walls remain, but they speak only indirectly. They tell you that people were here. They do not tell you why people decided not to be here anymore. That explanation exists only in inference, in patterns, in the slow logic of adaptation. And that leaves you, standing among the stones, with a lingering uncertainty. Was this the end of something, or just the continuation of it, somewhere else? When the last regular activities at Great Zimbabwe ceased, nothing dramatic marked the moment. No final ceremony closed the enclosures. No stone was deliberately toppled to signal an ending. The city did not know it was becoming a ruin. It simply stopped being a place where daily life gathered. This is important to understand, because it explains why Great Zimbabwe lingers in history as a question rather than a conclusion. Once the population dispersed, the stone complexes entered a different phase of existence. Weather continued its slow work. Vegetation pressed against walls. Stones loosened and settled, though far less dramatically than mud structures would have. The architecture endured because it had been built with endurance in mind. The people, meanwhile, did not disappear. They moved into new political formations that rose to prominence in the region. The Kingdom of Mutapa, for example, controlled trade routes and resources that Great Zimbabwe once had. Leadership structures, spiritual practices, and economic strategies continued, adapted to new geographies. From the perspective of those living through the transition, this was not collapse, it was succession. But succession without monuments is difficult to trace. Later societies did not rebuild Great Zimbabwe or reoccupy it as a central capital. They respected it, remembered it as ancestral ground, but did not attempt to restore its former function. In oral traditions, the site became associated with origins and authority rather than governance. It was a place you acknowledged, not a place you returned to. This reverence without reuse preserved the ruins remarkably well. Unlike cities that were quarried for stone or overbuilt by later populations, Great Zimbabwe remained largely untouched. Its walls were allowed to stand quietly, accumulating meaning rather than damage. That preservation, however, came at a cost. Without continuous habitation, the site slipped out of everyday awareness. Knowledge of its specific history blurred. Names and dates were replaced by generalized ancestral associations. By the time outsiders arrived, they encountered a site heavy with significance but light on explanation. And into that silence, assumptions rushed in. Colonial-era interpretations of Great Zimbabwe reveal as much about the observers as the site itself. Faced with evidence of complex stone construction, trade networks, and political organization, European writers struggled to reconcile what they saw with their beliefs about African societies. Rather than adjust those beliefs, they adjusted the story. They attributed the ruins to outsiders, Phoenicians, Arabs, or biblical figures, anyone, except the people whose descendants still lived nearby. These theories persisted for decades, shaping public understanding and academic discourse. The refusal to acknowledge local origins was not neutral. It actively erased African agency from the historical record. Only sustained archaeological work, combined with a willingness to challenge inherited assumptions, corrected this narrative. When scholars finally centered local material culture, settlement patterns, and oral traditions, a coherent picture emerged. Great Zimbabwe was the product of indigenous innovation, built over generations, and abandoned through rational adaptation rather than catastrophe. By then, the damage to historical memory had already been done. Great Zimbabwe had been transformed into a puzzle rather than a precedent. Today, the site stands as a reminder of how history treats endurance without documentation. The walls are among the largest stone structures in sub-Saharan Africa. They demonstrate engineering skill, social organization, and long-term planning. Yet for centuries, they were discussed more for what they supposedly weren't than for what they were. This distortion highlights another way history can barely notice, something not through absence, but through misinterpretation. Standing inside the great enclosure now, you feel a sense of scale that resists simplification. The walls curve inward, guiding movement and attention. Sound behaves differently inside. The space encourages slowness. Even without knowing its original purpose, you can tell it mattered. But meaning alone does not guarantee remembrance. Great Zimbabwe's story lacks the narrative hooks that modern history often favors. There is no single villain, no dramatic destruction, no clear moral failure. Instead, there is a long, measured adjustment to changing conditions, followed by respect for what came before. That kind of story requires patience to tell and patience to hear. It also requires a willingness to accept that decline is not always a negative judgment. Sometimes, leaving is the most sustainable choice available. Sometimes, survival means not insisting on permanence. Great Zimbabwe did not vanish like he like. It did not sink beneath water or crumble overnight. It remained visible, solid, undeniable. And yet, in many ways, it was easier to ignore than he liked. Because it did not force attention. Its builders did not leave written warnings or explanations. They trusted that what mattered would carry forward through people rather than place. And in that, they were partly right. Cultural practices, trade strategies, and political structures adapted and continued elsewhere. But the physical center, the city itself, became a quiet witness rather than an active participant. History noticed the stones. It struggled with the people. In the end, Great Zimbabwe asks you to reconsider what disappearance looks like. Not all losses are sudden. Not all endings are violent. Some are measured, practical, and deeply human. The city did not fail. It fulfilled its purpose and was left behind when that purpose changed. And yet, standing there now, you cannot escape the feeling that something important slipped through history's fingers, not because it was destroyed, but because it ended without demanding to be remembered. That may be the most unsettling lesson of all. Story 3. Cahokia and the Day the Mounds Went Quiet. If you were traveling along the Mississippi River around the 11th century CE, you would have noticed something unusual along the floodplains of present-day Illinois. Rising above the forests and wetlands were massive earthen structures, pyramids of soil carefully shaped into platforms, mounds, and terraces. These were not natural hills. They were the product of human labor, meticulously arranged over generations. You had arrived at Cahokia. At first, the scale might not strike you immediately. The largest, Monk's Mound, stretches over 300 meters across and towers more than 30 meters above the surrounding landscape. It is so enormous that even today it dominates the horizon. But it is not a single monument. It is the culmination of countless small decisions, loads of earth carried by hand, tamped down, shaped with purpose, mound upon mound added over decades. It is a city built slowly, patiently, like sediment accumulating to form something larger than its parts. For the people who lived there, Cahokia was vibrant, complex, and central to the lives of thousands. Estimates vary, but at its height, the city may have housed 15,000 to 20,000 people. That made it larger than any European city north of the Alps at the same time. It was a metropolis in the heart of North America, yet it lacked written language, stone fortifications, and monuments made of durable material beyond earth and wood. Its endurance relied on human memory, labor, and ritual. Daily life was rhythmic. You would wake to the sun rising over the river, walk among wooden structures and plazas, hear drums from ceremonial spaces, and see smoke rising from cooking fires. Corn, beans, and squash were staples, cultivated in fields surrounding the central precinct. You would see artisans shaping copper, shell, and stone into ornaments and tools, and traders arriving with items from hundreds of kilometers away: mica from the Appalachian Mountains, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, seashells from the Gulf Coast. Cahokia thrived because its people understood networks of movement and resource management that connected them across vast distances. Hierarchy defined much of daily life. The city's center, with its ceremonial mounds and plazas, was reserved for leaders and ritual specialists. Status was expressed through architecture, burials, and visible displays of wealth. Monk's Mound, with its broad terraces and platform summit, was likely home to the paramount chief and his entourage. From there, one could look out over the entire settlement, observing the ebb and flow of human activity below a constant, controlled rhythm. Yet despite its size and sophistication, Cahokia's organization was delicate. It relied on careful coordination, labor management, and resource distribution. Corn fields required irrigation and rotation. Timber needed replacement. Wood for housing and fences was finite in the floodplain environment, which could be vulnerable to erosion, flooding, and fire. Population density amplified these challenges. The city's survival depended on social cohesion and environmental awareness. By the late 13th century, something began to change. Signs of stress appeared in the archaeological record. Population density may have exceeded the local environment's sustainable limits. Evidence suggests erosion of agricultural soils, shortages of firewood, and declining quality in staple crops. The city had grown enormous, but with growth came fragility. Small deviations in rainfall, flooding patterns, or social cooperation could ripple outward, challenging the structures that had previously maintained order. We can imagine how people experienced this. Perhaps the once reliable floodplains became unpredictable. Fields failed, prompting adjustments in diet or labor allocation. Leaders faced difficult choices: redistribute resources, enforce stricter controls, or encourage relocation. Decisions were made in context, not hindsight, with incomplete information and high stakes. Even under stress, life continued. Ceremonies were still performed. Mounds continued to be maintained, at least in part. Artisans continued to craft ornaments. Traders continued to arrive, albeit perhaps less frequently. Human resilience allowed the city to endure far longer than environmental or social pressures might have predicted. And yet, despite these efforts, Cahokia began to empty. It did not fall to invaders. No catastrophic fire or earthquake erased it in a single night. Instead, people left in stages. Neighborhoods were abandoned. Houses fell into disrepair. Plazas once filled with bodies and drums became quiet. The great earthen mounds stood, largely intact, as silent witnesses to the human activity that had vanished. Why did this happen? Scholars debate. Some point to environmental degradation, soil exhaustion, deforestation, flooding as a driving factor. Others emphasize social dynamics, political conflict, or shifts in trade networks. Likely, the explanation is a combination: complex, interwoven pressures that together made the city unsustainable. Importantly, these pressures unfolded slowly. Cahokia did not vanish overnight, but over decades or perhaps a century. The heartbeat of the city slowed until it was barely noticeable. From the perspective of future generations, this gradual abandonment left the city vulnerable to myth and speculation. When later peoples arrived in the region, the mounds remained, but their original purpose had faded from memory. Without written records, the story of Cahokia became partially lost, accessible only through oral traditions, archaeology, and inference. Standing among the mounds today, it is easy to forget that this was a living city with families, disputes, markets, and rituals. The silence can be deceptive. You see the physical endurance of earthworks, but the stories of ordinary life, the rhythms of waking, eating, working, playing, are invisible. The city's disappearance from human memory is total, even though the land itself remembers. Cahokia teaches a lesson that is both subtle and profound. Cities are not immortal. They can grow, flourish, and dominate landscapes, yet still be subject to environmental limits, social pressures, and gradual decline. Power is temporal, even when inscribed in monumental forms. And yet, the human impulse to build, organize, and control remains, leaving traces long after the people themselves have moved on. So, as you walk among the earthen giants today, imagining the voices and footsteps that once animated the space, you are confronted with an uncomfortable thought. If a city as monumental as Cahokia could fade quietly, with its decline largely unnoticed by the wider world at the time, how many other centers of human activity have disappeared in ways that history never fully recorded? How many stories were lost simply because the rhythm of departure was measured and unremarkable, rather than dramatic? It is a question that lingers in the quiet air above the mounds, a whisper of the past that refuses to resolve itself neatly. If you had lived in Cahokia during its peak, you might have believed that the city would last forever. Its mounds were solid, its plazas well-maintained, and its social structures organized with precision. People had lived here for generations, constructing an intricate lattice of trade, ritual, and governance that allowed tens of thousands to coexist in what might otherwise seem a fragile environment. Yet, cities, even monumental ones, are not immune to the subtleties of change. Archaeological evidence suggests that Cahokia's decline was not a sudden disaster, but a slow, deliberate process. Certain neighborhoods show signs of abandonment while others remained active for years. Tools and pottery disappear unevenly. The largest structures, Monk's Mound and the associated ceremonial plazas, stand intact, but the surrounding housing areas become overgrown, their wooden posts rotting in place. It is as if the city's energy bled out gradually, leaving the skeleton of its past achievements. Daily life in this final phase was likely a mixture of continuity and adaptation. Families may have moved to smaller, more sustainable settlements nearby. Trade routes shifted in response to declining population density, making formerly vital economic connections less reliable. Agricultural yields could no longer support the city's peak population, forcing decisions that prioritized survival over urban permanence. The choices made were pragmatic rather than heroic, focused on maintaining stability rather than resisting inevitable change. Consider a hypothetical family, a group of farmers, artisans, and their children. Each day begins with tending fields of maize and beans, maintaining shelters, and participating in ritual obligations. Over time, the fields yield less, wood becomes scarcer, and social tensions rise as resources become strained. Leaders may urge partial relocation to nearby areas with better conditions, sending the youngest, the healthiest, or those most skilled in trade ahead to establish new communities. The elderly and those tied to tradition may stay longer, maintaining ceremonial practices even as neighbors leave. Eventually, even these last residents follow, until the streets and plazas echo only with wind and rain. This kind of departure is easy to overlook. It is unspectacular. There is no single moment to commemorate, no dramatic collapse, and yet it is profoundly transformative. The city loses its population, its energy, and the vitality that made it recognizable as a living center. Its mounds, impressive as they are, become silent markers of human absence. The reasons for Cahokia's decline are still debated, but likely reflect a combination of factors. Environmental pressure. Intensive agriculture on the floodplains may have led to soil depletion. Deforestation for housing and fuel could have altered local water tables or increased vulnerability to floods. Small environmental shifts can have outsized effects in a densely populated city. Social complexity. Cahokia's hierarchical society required careful coordination of labor, resources, and ritual obligations. Maintaining these systems under environmental or economic stress could strain political authority, encouraging gradual migration rather than confrontation. Economic shifts. Trade networks were extensive but vulnerable. Changes in demand, competition from other centers, or disruptions along river routes could reduce the city's wealth, decreasing its capacity to support its population and elaborate ceremonial life. Demographic saturation. At its peak, the city may have reached the maximum population that its surrounding environment could support. Beyond this threshold, even minor inefficiencies in food production or distribution could lead to relocation. Even without a single catastrophic event, the city's population decreased over time. Evidence suggests that some individuals maintained ritual practices atop the mounds for a period after residential areas were abandoned, possibly in an attempt to maintain the spiritual or political significance of Cahokia, even as the population dwindled. This extended presence contrasts with the total silence found in the residential zones, highlighting the slow unraveling of human settlement from the ceremonial core outward. For historians and archaeologists, this gradual decline presents challenges. Unlike cities destroyed by war or earthquake, Cahokia's end cannot be pinpointed to a single date or dramatic event. Instead, its disappearance is legible only through subtle clues: the absence of tools, the cessation of building activity, and changes in burial patterns. It is a story of process rather than moment, demanding careful interpretation and patience. From the perspective of a contemporary observer, the city's endurance and subsequent quietude would be startling. Imagine walking through the main plazas and seeing the massive mounds rise above overgrown paths, with the remnants of wooden structures still hinting at their former order. It is a city preserved, yet emptied, a monument not to victory or catastrophe, but to the impermanence of human activity in the face of slow, cumulative pressures. And yet, even as people left, the mounds maintained their presence. They became anchors of memory, physical reminders of a city that once thrived. Future generations, encountering these structures without understanding their original social or economic context, could only speculate about their meaning. Oral traditions preserved some knowledge of the mounds, ceremonial purposes, but much was lost or reshaped over centuries. Here, the contrast with Helike is instructive. Helike vanished suddenly beneath the sea, leaving only a brief note in historical accounts and a few archaeological traces. Cahokia declined slowly, leaving monumental evidence that was preserved in place but increasingly silent. One city demanded attention through sudden absence, the other through enduring emptiness. Both reveal how human societies are fragile, yet in profoundly different ways. The question that lingers, as you stand atop the mounds today or walk along their terraces, is deceptively simple. How do you measure the significance of a city that faded quietly, without destruction, without catastrophe, and without leaving written records? How many other settlements once vibrant, once essential, have followed similar trajectories, leaving behind stones, earthworks, and faint traces, but no story to announce their passing? Cahokia's mounds are monumental, yet mute. They testify to human ingenuity, planning, and coordination, but also to impermanence and adaptation. They remind us that history is not only about dramatic events or spectacular collapses, it is also about the slow, almost invisible rhythms of life, migration, and departure that quietly shape the past. And if you listen carefully, the silence of Cahokia is almost palpable, a reminder that cities can disappear not in fiery spectacle, but in the quiet steps of people choosing to move on, leaving the earth itself as witness. By the time the last inhabitants of Cahokia moved away, the city had already lost its defining rhythms. Plazas once alive with ceremony were empty. Streets that had teemed with traders and laborers were overgrown. The structures of wood and thatch collapsed slowly under the seasons, leaving only the mounds silent, enduring, and unyielding. For the people who left, life continued elsewhere. Families relocated to smaller settlements along the river or to regions where agriculture remained reliable. Social hierarchies reconstituted themselves in new contexts, leadership shifted, and the networks of trade and ritual adapted to new circumstances. From their perspective, Cahokia was not a failure. It was a choice, a strategic adaptation to changing environmental, social, and economic conditions. Yet for later generations encountering Cahokia, the story was different. Without people, the city became a monumental mystery. The mounds remained, impressive in scale but opaque in meaning. Observers could measure them, count terraces, and study alignments with the sun, but the intangible life that had animated them, the social negotiations, the daily routines, the markets and festivals, was gone. This created the illusion of a frozen moment, a city poised at its peak, yet abandoned without reason. Archaeologists, centuries later, have tried to reconstruct life at Cahokia through pottery shards, post holes, burial sites, and botanical evidence. These clues reveal glimpses of diet, craft, ceremony, and social structure. They suggest a vibrant city with complex social hierarchies, significant trade networks, and ritualistic sophistication. Yet, despite all this data, the final chapters of Cahokia remain open to interpretation. Part of the enigma lies in the lack of written records. Unlike cities in Mesopotamia, Egypt, or Mesoamerica, Cahokia's people left no inscriptions or texts detailing political events, trade agreements, or religious observances. Their story survives only through the traces of labor etched into the landscape and the objects left behind. This silence challenges modern historians, forcing reliance on inference and analogy to reconstruct what once was. One striking feature of Cahokia's final phase is the unevenness of abandonment. Some areas were deserted early, while others continued to be used sporadically. Ceremonial spaces atop mounds may have been maintained even after residential zones emptied. Certain burial practices continued, albeit at a smaller scale, indicating that the city retained spiritual significance even as it lost population density. This reveals a society negotiating continuity and change, preserving sacred traditions even while practical life moved elsewhere. The reasons for Cahokia's decline are complex and intertwined. Environmental stresses, soil depletion, erosion, deforestation, and fluctuating floodplains likely contributed. Social dynamics, including the management of labor, political cohesion, and leadership succession, would have added pressure. Shifts in trade networks may have reduced access to vital materials or economic influence. Together, these factors created conditions in which gradual depopulation became the most rational response. Unlike Helike, which disappeared suddenly under the sea, Cahokia faded quietly. There was no single catastrophic moment to memorialize, no dramatic story to attract attention. Its end was incremental, marked by a thinning of life rather than a violent rupture. The result is a paradox. The city's physical footprint is enormous, yet its story can be difficult to discern. The monumental mounds survive as enduring markers, but the lived human experience the bustle of markets, the songs of ceremonies, the daily rhythms of work and family has vanished almost completely. This quiet disappearance raises profound questions about how history remembers or fails to remember places that decline gradually. In many ways, Cahokia challenges modern assumptions about historical significance. A city can be massive, complex, and socially sophisticated, yet escape the broader historical narrative simply because its decline lacked spectacle. Standing atop Monk's Mound today, one cannot help but feel a combination of awe and melancholy. The sheer scale of the labor is apparent, as is the careful planning and social coordination required to maintain the city at its height. Yet the silence is deafening. Where once thousands lived, worked, traded, and celebrated, now there is only wind, birdsong, and the occasional visitor. Cahokia reminds us that the endurance of material culture does not guarantee the survival of memory. The mounds, the earthworks, and the artifacts are all that remain of a vibrant society. Their silence invites contemplation. It forces recognition that history is shaped not only by what is remembered, but also by what fades quietly, leaving only traces and questions. If Helike teaches us about the sudden fragility of human endeavors, Cahokia teaches us about the subtle impermanence of human systems. One vanished overnight, the other faded over decades. Both demonstrate that cities, no matter how monumental or sophisticated, are ultimately contingent. They exist within a complex web of environmental, social, and economic pressures that determine their lifespan. And when those pressures shift, even the most impressive human constructions can be left behind, slowly turning into memory rather than living reality. As you leave the mounds today, perhaps the most unsettling thought lingers. The city that once thrived, negotiated the rhythms of life and environment, and fostered human creativity and ritual, now exists primarily as absence. Its story survives only in fragments, in soil samples, in the patterns of earth and post holes, and in the interpretations of those willing to listen carefully to what remains. Cahokia did not end in fire or flood. It ended in quiet negotiation with circumstance, in the choice to move on when the city could no longer sustain the life it had once held. And yet, in that quiet departure, it leaves a profound lesson. Permanence is rare, and historical memory is fragile. What survives may be less about importance than about endurance, and what seems monumental may be quietly ephemeral. The mounds stand and they endure, but the city is gone, and in that silence lies one of history's most subtle reminders. Civilizations do not always end with a bang. Sometimes they vanish softly, leaving behind traces that challenge the way we understand legacy, permanence, and human resilience. Story 4. Akrotiri, Pompeii before Pompeii without the fame. If you imagine a bustling city on the Aegean island of Thera, around the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE, you would picture streets lined with 2- and 3-story houses, narrow alleyways filled with the smells of cooking, workshops where artisans shaped clay, metal, and stone, and marketplaces humming with trade. Akrotiri, the settlement archaeologists excavated centuries later, was precisely such a city. Its sophistication rivals that of contemporary cities on Crete, yet for centuries, it remained largely unknown outside specialized academic circles. The city occupied a strategic location on the island of Thera, now known as Santorini. It was ideally situated for trade in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean, acting as a hub for goods, ideas, and people. Pottery from Crete, luxury items from the Cyclades, and possibly even raw materials from mainland Greece and Asia Minor flowed through the city. The inhabitants were well aware of their connections, which brought both wealth and social complexity. Yet Akrotiri's brilliance was not merely in trade. It was in urban planning, architecture, and engineering. Streets were organized with careful consideration of drainage. Multi-story houses had private staircases, built-in storage, and light wells that allowed sunlight into interior rooms. Frescoes adorned walls, depicting landscapes, rituals, and possibly daily life, providing a vivid, almost cinematic window into the aesthetics and priorities of the society. Water management was sophisticated, and there are signs that the inhabitants understood seasonal patterns well. Roofs were built to channel water into cisterns, ensuring supply during drier months. Food was stored carefully in jars, and large quantities of pottery suggest both domestic use and trade surplus. The city's material culture indicates a society deeply embedded in its environment, maximizing the benefits of its volcanic island while preparing for the uncertainties of weather and season. And yet, for all its ingenuity, Akrotiri's fate was sealed by the very environment that had sustained it. In the mid-17th century BCE, Thera experienced a catastrophic volcanic eruption. This was no minor event. The eruption released enormous volumes of pumice, ash, and volcanic gases. Some estimates suggest it may have been among the largest eruptions in human history. Ash rained down on Akrotiri, burying streets, homes, and workshops in layers that would preserve the city for millennia. Unlike many other disasters, this one was sudden enough to halt the city's rhythm, yet slow enough in its initial stages that the final moments of everyday life could be encoded in the very materials left behind. The preservation is extraordinary. Buildings were filled with household items, pottery, and tools, frozen as if time itself had paused. Frescoes remained largely intact because ash insulated them from exposure, protecting colors and designs from weathering. Wooden beams were carbonized rather than fully consumed, leaving traces of architecture that would have otherwise decayed entirely. Unlike Pompeii, Akrotiri contains no preserved human remains, suggesting that the inhabitants may have evacuated in time. This absence creates a peculiar tension. The city is perfectly preserved, yet largely devoid of people, their bodies removed while their possessions remained. This raises immediate questions about the final moments of Akrotiri. How much did the residents know of the impending eruption? Did warnings come in the form of earthquakes, ash clouds, or smoke from the caldera? Archaeologists have identified evidence of minor tremors prior to the eruption, which might have alerted inhabitants to danger. Perhaps families, traders, and craftsmen left in phases, attempting to salvage belongings or warn neighbors. Unlike sudden disasters where victims are caught unaware, Akrotiri's end appears to have been a partial evacuation, a negotiation with circumstance rather than a confrontation with inevitability. The city's social and economic structure may have contributed to this measured departure. Leaders and ritual authorities likely coordinated the response, deciding which households would move first, which stores or workshops were essential to preserve, and how to maintain social cohesion during a time of uncertainty. In this sense, the evacuation may have been orderly, a testament to both the administrative and cultural sophistication of the city. Unlike Helike, which vanished abruptly, or Cahokia, which faded gradually, Akrotiri occupies a liminal space, preserved in the moment of transition between life and abandonment. Life before the eruption, when reconstructed through architecture and artifacts, was remarkably complex. Frescoes suggest ritualized interactions with nature, possibly including seasonal celebrations or agricultural rites. Pottery shows both utilitarian and decorative purposes, indicating attention to domestic life as well as social display. The economy relied on specialized labor. Artisans crafted goods for local use and trade. Fishermen and sailors connected Akrotiri to distant markets, and administrators coordinated both domestic and commercial activities. The urban organization itself tells a story. Houses were often clustered around courtyards, suggesting communal interaction and shared responsibilities. Storage rooms indicate careful planning, anticipating surplus, scarcity, or redistribution. The alignment of streets and terraces reflects an understanding of natural light, prevailing winds, and water flow practical knowledge embedded in the urban fabric. Despite all this, the eruption rendered daily life impossible. Streets became choked with pumice, homes filled with ash, and the city was no longer habitable. Yet this was not destruction in the conventional sense. Walls remained upright, frescoes survived, artifacts remained in place. Akrotiri did not collapse, it was paused, waiting for the centuries to tell its story. And it would wait in obscurity, largely unnoticed outside archaeological circles, until excavations began in the 20th century. In its preserved state, Akrotiri offers a paradox. It provides a near-perfect snapshot of Bronze Age life, yet lacks the human narrative of survival or death that usually animates historical memory. Unlike Pompeii, where victims' bodies make the tragedy tangible, Akrotiri presents an almost sterile silence. A city of ghosts, abundant in objects, minimal in people. Scholars must infer social structures, rituals, and choices without the direct testimony of the departed. The richness of material culture compensates for this absence, but also amplifies the questions about daily life, human decisions, and the choices made in the face of impending disaster. What emerges from this juxtaposition is a subtle lesson in historical perception. Akrotiri, like Helike and Cahokia, challenges the notion that history is always dramatic, linear, or easily categorized. It is a city of extraordinary preservation, yet largely invisible to the broader narratives of human civilization for centuries. It exists in a liminal space, between survival and memory, caught between the natural world and human agency. Standing in the excavated streets today, or imagining the city as it was, one confronts a striking thought. Human ingenuity and careful planning can endure remarkably, yet even the most sophisticated cities are vulnerable to forces beyond immediate control. Akrotiri survived under layers of ash, but only as material culture. The people themselves are absent, their choices, fears, and resilience encoded subtly in artifacts, architecture, and evacuation patterns. And it leaves you with a question that is hard to shake. How many cities in history have survived as shadows, preserved physically but invisible socially, awaiting discovery to reveal lives lived, choices made, and the delicate balance between human agency and environmental inevitability? If you had been in Akrotiri on that day, or more likely, over a series of days, you might not have realized that the city's rhythm was approaching its final chapter. Life would have seemed familiar. Children running through narrow streets, women carrying water from wells, men tending boats or workshops, artisans shaping pottery and frescoing walls. The markets were busy, smells of cooking drifted through alleyways, and the hum of conversation filled courtyards. All the signs of continuity remained, masking the impending transformation. But the signs were there. Small tremors, unusual ash plumes from the caldera, and subtle shifts in air and light would have hinted that something was changing. For those attuned to natural rhythms, these signs may have been sufficient warning. Thera's inhabitants were no strangers to geological instability. Living on a volcanic island, they had learned to observe the environment carefully, the movement of the earth, the behavior of animals, and the changes in the air. What likely followed was an organized, measured evacuation. Unlike a sudden catastrophe, which leaves victims trapped and unprepared, this scenario involved decisions, priorities, and social coordination. Households may have dismantled what they could carry, taking valuables, essential tools, and perishable goods. Leaders or elders may have directed traffic along safe routes, coordinated temporary shelters, and ensured that the youngest, oldest, or most vulnerable members had guidance. The streets would have emptied gradually, perhaps starting with those closest to danger or most attuned to environmental cues. Archaeological evidence supports this interpretation. Human remains are scarce, suggesting that most people escaped. Artifacts were left behind, yes, but the most valuable items, tools, jewelry, portable containers, were taken. Frescoes and immovable architectural elements remained, not because the residents intended to abandon them, but because they could not carry them. In this sense, Eerie became a city preserved by necessity and geology, frozen between abandonment and continuity. Daily life during this evacuation phase would have been tense but deliberate. Imagine families negotiating what to take, balancing survival with attachment. Traders may have salvaged materials vital for commerce. Artisans may have taken tools essential to their craft. Houses would have been emptied in an order dictated not only by logic, but by social hierarchy. The wealthy and influential likely prioritized their possessions first, leaving laborers and lower status families to manage with what remained. Even as the city emptied, life did not stop entirely. Some evidence suggests that certain ceremonial or ritual practices persisted through early stages of the evacuation. Perhaps priests or leaders maintained sacred spaces, performing rites to ensure divine protection during the migration. Courtyards and shrines may have been used for last offerings, while residents prepared to leave behind the tangible spaces of their everyday life. It is important to understand that this evacuation was not a failure. It was an adaptive strategy, a demonstration of human agency in the face of overwhelming natural forces. The absence of sudden destruction underscores the sophistication of Eerie's society. Its inhabitants were observers of their environment, planners capable of large-scale coordination, and decision-makers able to prioritize survival while preserving social order. The eruption itself, when it fully came, transformed the landscape almost instantaneously, but its impact on human life had already been mitigated. Ash and pumice buried streets, houses, and workshops, creating the extraordinary preservation that would intrigue archaeologists millennia later. Yet the people were largely gone, leaving behind an impression of a city paused rather than destroyed. This measured evacuation creates a curious duality. Eerie is both a disaster site and a triumph of human adaptation. Its physical preservation provides unparalleled insight into Bronze Age urban life. The layout of streets, the construction of houses, the decorative schemes, and even the functional design of kitchens, storerooms, and drainage systems. At the same time, the human element, the stories, fears, and final choices, is largely invisible, inferred from the pattern of artifacts rather than directly witnessed. The city's social and economic structures reveal much about its ability to respond to crisis. Leadership was hierarchical, yet not tyrannical. Social cohesion appears to have been sufficient to coordinate evacuation without chaos. Trade networks likely provided both information and access to resources, allowing families to leave prepared. Knowledge of agriculture, weather patterns, and geography would have informed decisions about routes, timing, and temporary settlements. Yet even as you admire this adaptive capacity, there is a lingering unease. The city's survival in material form, its preservation under volcanic ash, cannot replicate the lived human experience. The laughter of children, the smells of cooking, the interpersonal conflicts, and the daily negotiations for food and shelter are gone. What remains is structure, frozen in time, without the vitality that gave it meaning. Akrotiri's story, therefore, exists in tension. It is a city of remarkable preservation, yet it is largely a ghost town. It was evacuated in time, yet this very evacuation ensured that the vibrancy of daily life was lost to history. Its silence challenges modern interpretations. How can a city preserved so well still remain invisible socially, culturally, and historically? How can the physical footprint endure, while the memory of its inhabitants requires reconstruction from indirect evidence? The answer lies in the interplay between human foresight and environmental inevitability. Akrotiri's people acted with intelligence, observation, and social coordination, yet they were subject to forces beyond full control. Their evacuation preserved life, but also ensured that material culture outlasted living memory. The city exists today as a puzzle, a repository of information frozen in ash, waiting for those who can interpret its traces. And as you contemplate this city of ghosts and stones, one question persists. If Akrotiri survived as a city without people, what does this say about human legacy? How much of what we create is remembered for our lives, and how much endures only as silent evidence, requiring future observers to reconstruct meaning from what we leave behind? The city's answer is embedded in the ash. Survival is possible, memory is fragile, and history notices only when it chooses or when it is forced by the endurance of matter to pause and reflect. By the time Akrotiri was fully buried under volcanic ash, the city had already passed from the world of the living into a strange, intermediate state, a city preserved but empty, monumental but silent. Streets and houses remained intact in form, frescoes adorned walls, pottery and tools were left in place, yet the people themselves were largely gone. Unlike Helike, which disappeared with sudden finality, or Cahokia, which emptied slowly over decades, Akrotiri represents a peculiar middle ground. Abandoned with foreknowledge, preserved by catastrophe, and forgotten for centuries until rediscovered by archaeologists. The process of preservation was remarkable. Ash from the Thera eruption sealed the city, insulating walls and paintings, carbonizing timber just enough to leave traces, and burying streets and artifacts in layers that protected them from the ravages of time. Wooden beams and stairs, which would normally decay within decades, left imprints. Frescoes retained their pigments, capturing scenes of dolphins, rituals, and landscapes with astonishing clarity. Every excavation reveals a society frozen in motion, a daily life paused mid-step, a city captured in amber, waiting for eyes that would not arrive for millennia. And yet this preservation comes with a paradox. The city is physically vivid but socially silent. We can see the homes, the workshops, the markets, but we cannot hear the voices, understand the jokes, feel the anxiety, or witness the deliberation that guided the evacuation. Scholars have had to reconstruct the human element from indirect evidence. Footprints preserved in ash, discarded pottery, architectural choices, and the careful arrangement of streets and homes. Even the absence of bodies tells a story. It suggests foresight, planning, and coordinated action. But the inhabitants themselves remain invisible, leaving a city rich in artifacts but poor in direct human testimony. The evacuation, while orderly, likely involved difficult choices. Families had to decide what to take and what to leave behind, balancing necessity, attachment, and social norms. Traders and artisans may have prioritized portable goods, while sacred or communal objects were abandoned. The psychological impact of leaving homes, streets, and spaces imbued with memory is impossible to reconstruct fully. But the effort required to move a population from a city on the brink of disaster implies significant social organization, trust, and leadership. Akrotiri also reveals the interdependence of human ingenuity and environmental forces. Its residents had long adapted to volcanic island life, developing urban layouts, water management systems, and agricultural practices suited to their environment. Yet even the most sophisticated adaptations were insufficient to prevent evacuation in the face of a massive eruption. The city's ingenuity allowed survival, but only by leaving the physical structures intact beneath layers of ash. Here, survival did not mean preservation of life and place simultaneously. The city remained as a monument, but the living network of inhabitants relocated. This tension between preservation and absence gives Akrotiri its haunting quality. It is a city of ghosts in the most literal sense, physically present, historically silent, and socially absent. Visitors walking its excavated streets today can feel the weight of human presence without encountering the humans themselves. Every wall, every fresco, every carefully constructed stairway hints at a story, yet the story itself is incomplete. Moreover, Akrotiri's obscurity for centuries demonstrates how human memory can fail even in the presence of remarkable material evidence. Unlike Pompeii, which captured popular imagination almost immediately after its rediscovery, Akrotiri remained largely unknown outside academic circles until the mid-20th century. Its extraordinary preservation could not guarantee historical fame. Human attention, political priorities, and the narratives that societies choose to emphasize determine which ruins enter the collective memory, and which remain quiet like Akrotiri for generations. Standing amidst the city today, or imagining it as it was, you confront the fragility of legacy. Akrotiri reminds us that even the most sophisticated human constructions are subject to forces beyond control, geological, environmental, and temporal. Yet it also shows that human decision-making, the foresight, the evacuation, the prioritization of life over property, can leave traces of ingenuity, resilience, and social coordination for future generations to interpret. In its preserved state, Akrotiri challenges conventional historical narratives. It is not a story of dramatic collapse, bloody conflict, or moral failing. It is a story of adaptation, evacuation, and endurance through absence. The city survived not by resisting nature, but by responding intelligently, albeit in a way that left the human narrative incomplete. Its legacy is paradoxical, a city preserved perfectly in form, yet silent in human terms, a material testament to both ingenuity and impermanence. And in that silence lies one of history's most subtle reminders. Cities, no matter how monumental or well-organized, are always contingent. Human agency can mitigate disaster, but cannot fully control it. Survival is possible, but permanence is not guaranteed. Akrotiri endures as a lesson in both resilience and impermanence, showing that what survives materially may outlast what is remembered socially, and that history often notices the structures more than the people who created them. As you leave the ruins, there is a lingering question. If Akrotiri's people survived by abandoning the city, what is the measure of their legacy? Is it the preservation of walls, frescoes, and streets? Or is it the wisdom and foresight embedded in the very act of evacuation, the decision to save lives while leaving behind a city that would speak silently across millennia? The city answers in ash. Human life is fleeting, cities are vulnerable, and memory is selective. Yet the structures remain, enduring against time, a testament to both the brilliance and the fragility of civilizations, waiting patiently for the world to notice. Story 5. Vinland, the Norse settlement that the world forgot. Imagine standing on a windswept coastline in what is now Newfoundland, Canada, around the year 1000 CE. Cold Atlantic winds whip across rocky shores, waves crash against jagged cliffs, and the forest behind you is dense, dark, and seemingly endless. In this harsh, unfamiliar environment, a small band of Norse settlers has arrived, far beyond the familiar fjords of Greenland and Iceland. This is Vinland, the edge of the known world for the Norse, a land full of promise, danger, and uncertainty. The Norse voyages to Vinland were ambitious. Led by explorers like Leif Erikson, these journeys relied on detailed knowledge of the sea, the stars, and the currents of the North Atlantic. Longships carried families, livestock, and supplies across treacherous waters. For those aboard, the ocean was both highway and adversary, capable of delivering opportunity or disaster with equal swiftness. Arriving at Vinland was only the first step. Survival there demanded adaptation, ingenuity, and careful negotiation with the unfamiliar environment. Vinland was strikingly different from Greenland and Iceland. Its climate was milder, forests dense, and soils fertile in comparison to the rocky northern islands. Timber was abundant, essential for building, heating, and crafting tools. Rivers teemed with fish, and the land supported game like caribou and elk. For Norse settlers accustomed to limited resources, this abundance must have seemed miraculous, offering a chance to establish a new foothold in the West. Yet the promise of Vinland was tempered by real dangers. The land was unfamiliar. Weather could shift suddenly from mild to stormy. Winter, while shorter than in Greenland, was still harsh enough to test unprepared settlers. And most importantly, the Norse were not alone. Indigenous peoples had lived in the region for millennia, hunting, fishing, and cultivating the land. Contact between Norse settlers and native populations could be cooperative or contentious, influenced by trade, misunderstanding, and territorial claims. The settlements themselves were modest. Archaeological evidence at Eland's Ox Meadows, the only confirmed Norse site in North America, reveals simple timber structures, huts with sod roofs, workshops for ironworking, and communal spaces for cooking and storage. The layout suggests temporary or semi-permanent occupation rather than fully established towns. Houses were small, often less than 10 meters across, designed to shelter small family units or working crews. They were practical, built to withstand harsh weather, and constructed using familiar Norse techniques adapted to local materials. Life in Vinland was labor-intensive and precarious. Settlers had to hunt and fish to supplement supplies brought from Greenland, fell trees for timber, carve sod for insulation, and maintain shelters against wind, rain, and snow. Seasonal rhythms governed activity. Summers were used for building, exploration, and gathering provisions. Winters were a time of confinement, careful rationing, and survival. Unlike settlements in the familiar North Atlantic, there was little room for error. Each choice where to hunt, what to store, how to construct shelters had immediate consequences. Trade and resources also shaped the settlement. Evidence of ironworking, including furnaces and slag, indicates that Norse settlers attempted to process local ore. But the scarcity of some essential materials, coupled with the difficulties of transporting goods from Greenland, limited long-term sustainability. Timber and fertile land were abundant, but labor and energy were finite. Every day required careful allocation of human and natural resources, a constant negotiation between ambition and practicality. Interactions with indigenous peoples were likely complex. Archaeological clues and Norse sagas suggest trade in furs, food, and other goods. At the same time, disputes and violence may have occurred, creating additional pressures for the settlers. For a small community on the margins of the known world, even minor conflicts could have outsized consequences, threatening food security or social cohesion. Despite the challenges, Vinland represents a remarkable chapter in human exploration. Norse settlers were venturing farther west than any Europeans for centuries. They carried knowledge, technology, and cultural practices across thousands of kilometers of ocean. The settlement demonstrates both courage and ingenuity, a human drive to expand horizons even into landscapes that are difficult, unfamiliar, and potentially hostile. And yet, Vinland's story is one of impermanence. The settlement was short-lived, lasting perhaps only a decade or two. It did not vanish in a dramatic catastrophe. There is no evidence of sudden destruction by storm or fire, nor records of epidemics that wiped out the population. Instead, the settlement was gradually abandoned, leaving only subtle traces in the archaeological record: post holes in the soil, fragments of iron and nails, and remnants of sod walls now reclaimed by the forest. The Norse moved back to Greenland, perhaps concluding that Vinland offered opportunity but not sustainability. From a historical perspective, Vinland is an unusual case. It is a European settlement in North America, centuries before Columbus, yet it leaves almost no imprint in historical memory. Unlike Helike or Cahokia, which have left visible ruins or monumental traces, Vinland was ephemeral, occupying space without creating a lasting, materially dominant presence. Its story survives in sagas, in oral tradition, and now in the careful work of archaeologists interpreting faint evidence thousands of years later. Standing in the dense forests of Newfoundland today, it is difficult to imagine the lives of those few settlers. How did they perceive the vast wilderness around them? What decisions did they make each day about what to hunt, where to build, and how to maintain their fragile social order? How did they manage uncertainty, knowing they were thousands of kilometers from the nearest familiar settlement? And what prompted them to leave, abandoning a place that held such promise? Vinland teaches a lesson that resonates with other forgotten histories. Not all settlements are designed to endure. Some exist as experiments, pushing the limits of human mobility and adaptation, yet leaving few traces when their purpose has been fulfilled. They vanish not through sudden disaster, but through pragmatic choice, environmental constraint, and the slow calculus of survival. And as you consider the silence of Vinland, one question lingers: how many other human attempts at settlement, exploration, or expansion have been forgotten not because they failed spectacularly, but because they ended quietly, leaving traces too subtle to dominate the historical record? The Norse settlement in Vinland was real, extraordinary, and short-lived, a fleeting chapter at the edge of the known world. Its survival is evident only in whispers of wood, iron, and sod, waiting for careful observation to reveal the story of human courage, ingenuity, and the delicate balance between ambition and limitation. By the time Norse settlers arrived in Vinland, the Atlantic world had already been traversed extensively by Vikings from Scandinavia. They were experienced sailors, accustomed to unpredictable seas, shifting weather, and the constant negotiation between human effort and natural forces. Yet Vinland was different from Greenland or Iceland. It was a new world densely forested, teeming with unfamiliar flora and fauna, and populated by people with their own long-established social, economic, and spiritual systems. Life on the edge of the known world was full of opportunity, but it was also precarious, and every day demanded vigilance, ingenuity, and adaptation. The first challenge was survival in a physically demanding environment. Forests were dense and required clearing for shelter, agriculture, and livestock. Trees were felled with axes, shaped into timber for houses and fences, and split to make firewood. The settlers had brought animals from Greenland: cattle, sheep, goats, but sustaining them required pastures, water, and protection from predators. Hunting and fishing supplemented these resources, but they also required skill, knowledge of local terrain, and the ability to adapt familiar techniques to an unfamiliar landscape. Agriculture, too, presented challenges. Crops like barley, rye, and oat, staples in Greenland, were sensitive to soil, climate, and frost. Settlers had to experiment with planting techniques, locations, and timing to achieve reliable yields. The short growing season of the northern Atlantic demanded precision, while natural pests, wildlife, and environmental variations threatened the fragile balance. Fields were small and intensively worked, each decision carrying consequences for food security. Failure to harvest enough could lead to starvation. Success meant a temporary reprieve, a chance to store provisions for the long winter months. Social organization under these conditions was critical. The Vinland settlement was small, likely consisting of a few dozen people at most. Families were interdependent, and the survival of each individual contributed directly to the group's overall security. Decisions about resource allocation, defense, and mobility had to be collective. Yet hierarchy still existed. Leadership likely fell to experienced explorers or chieftains with knowledge of Greenlandic and Icelandic politics, navigation, and survival. Leaders coordinated work, negotiated internal disputes, and mediated interactions with indigenous populations. Social cohesion was essential, and any fractures could have had immediate and fatal consequences. Interactions with local indigenous peoples, whom the Norse referred to as skrælings, added layers of complexity. These populations had occupied the land for generations, knew the seasonal rhythms intimately, and were skilled hunters, fishers, and gatherers. Some contact may have been cooperative. Trade in furs, food, or tools would have benefited both groups. At the same time, tensions were possible, perhaps even likely, due to competing territorial claims or misunderstandings. The Norse, few in number and dependent on local resources, would have needed to navigate these relationships carefully, balancing diplomacy, trade, and defense. A misstep could jeopardize food supplies, shelter security, or even survival itself. Life in Vinland was also dictated by seasonal rhythms. Summers were periods of labor-intensive work, clearing land, planting crops, repairing structures, hunting and fishing, and constructing timber buildings. Long hours were spent outdoors, under sun and rain, with the constant awareness of storms and unpredictable weather. Winters, by contrast, required shelter, rationing, and careful management of limited resources. Livestock had to be protected from cold, stored food monitored for spoilage, and human energy conserved for the long months of confinement. The cycle of work, survival, and anticipation of future seasons defined every aspect of existence. Daily life also required adaptation of technology. The Norse settlers brought iron tools, but they needed to maintain them carefully. Axes and knives dulled quickly on hardwoods, and repairs required skill and materials. Pottery and storage vessels, essential for preserving food, had to be crafted from local clay, often without the refinements available in European centers. Even simple tasks cutting firewood, building walls, cooking meals demanded creativity and resilience in a landscape very different from what the settlers had known. Despite these challenges, the Vinland settlement shows evidence of careful planning and adaptation. Archaeological remains at Elant's Ox Meadows include iron smelting sites, sodden timber houses, and workshops designed for specialized labor. These structures indicate that the settlers were not merely surviving, they were building a functioning community, applying familiar techniques to an unfamiliar environment, and attempting to establish a foothold that could last for generations. Yet Vinland's greatest vulnerability was its isolation. Unlike Greenland or Iceland, it had no established support network. Supplies from home were slow and unreliable, winter weather could cut off access entirely, and local resources, while abundant, required constant labor to exploit. For a small population, any disruption, conflict, poor harvests, illness, or storms could threaten the viability of the settlement. The combination of environmental pressure and logistical fragility meant that the margin for error was narrow, and long-term sustainability was uncertain. As winter approached, the Norse may have begun to realize the limits of their foothold. Perhaps they overestimated the capacity of local resources, underestimated the difficulty of maintaining social cohesion in isolation, or faced challenges in trading with indigenous peoples. Whatever the combination of factors, the decision to leave Vinland would have been pragmatic rather than catastrophic, a recognition that survival, not permanence, was the priority. The subtlety of this departure explains why Vinland has been forgotten in much of European history. Unlike cities destroyed in fire, flood, or conflict, there was no dramatic final moment to record. The settlement faded quietly, leaving only faint material traces and sparse references in Norse sagas. Archaeologists today must reconstruct life, labor, and decision-making from post holes, remnants of ironworking, and fragmented artifacts. Vinland's story is thus one of endurance on the edge of possibility, rather than conquest or collapse. And it leaves a lingering thought. History often notices places not because of longevity or scale, but because of spectacle or narrative clarity. Vinland was remarkable in ambition, sophistication, and adaptation, yet its quiet end rendered it nearly invisible in the larger historical imagination. How many other settlements exploring the limits of human endurance have been lost simply because their departures were measured, their failures subtle, and their traces delicate? Standing in the forest today, imagining the daily labor, strategic decisions, and constant awareness of risk, it becomes clear that Vinland was both extraordinary and ephemeral, a testament to human courage, ingenuity, and the limits imposed by environment, isolation, and practicality. Its survival, paradoxically, exists more in the questions it raises than in the structures it left behind. By the time the last Norse settlers departed from Vinland, the land had already reclaimed much of what they had built. Timber houses slowly rotted, sod walls collapsed, and cleared fields reverted to forest. The ironworking sites were abandoned, smelting hearths grew cold, and trails leading to the shore became overgrown. Unlike the mounds of Cahokia or the preserved streets of Akrotiri, Vinland left almost no monumental evidence of human activity. Its physical footprint was small, temporary, and easily swallowed by the relentless power of the Atlantic forests. The Norse did not vanish suddenly. There was no violent eruption, no enemy army to raze their homes, no disease to wipe out the population overnight. Their departure was pragmatic, a recognition that survival depended on returning to Greenland, where support networks, familiar resources, and community cohesion were assured. What they left behind was neither failure nor disaster. It was the practical decision of a small, isolated community facing environmental, logistical, and social limits. Despite its disappearance, Vinland remained remarkable for its ambition. These settlers had crossed thousands of kilometers of ocean, navigating unpredictable currents, storms, and icebergs. They had attempted to transplant familiar European ways of life into a new and unfamiliar environment, applying knowledge, tools, and social organization in a place far from home. They had observed, adapted, experimented, and survived long enough to leave tangible traces that would be discovered centuries later. In that sense, Vinland's legacy is less about permanence than about the courage to attempt life at the edge of the known world. Evidence of their presence survives primarily through archaeology. Elant's Ox Meadows provides a glimpse into daily life. Remains of sodden timber houses, workshops for ironworking, artifacts of Norse origin, and the faint traces of cleared land. These material traces allow historians to reconstruct the rhythm of life, the work of clearing forests, constructing shelters, hunting, fishing, and managing livestock. But the story of human experience, the decisions, fears, and negotiations that guided daily life, remains largely invisible, inferred only from patterns in the landscape and artifacts. The interaction with indigenous populations is equally enigmatic. The Norse sagas tell of encounters with Skraelings, but details are scarce. Trade, conflict, or cultural exchange may have occurred, but the archaeological record provides only subtle hints. The Norse were strangers in a land already occupied, negotiating survival and resources in a socially complex, unfamiliar environment. Their choice to leave may have been influenced as much by human factors, tensions, misunderstandings, isolation, as by environmental or logistical pressures. Vinland's disappearance from history demonstrates how fragility can be hidden in apparent success. Unlike Cahokia, which declined gradually, or Akrotiri, which was preserved in ash, Vinland's traces were ephemeral. Without dramatic catastrophe, monuments, or written records, it faded quietly from European memory, only surviving in the sagas and the occasional artifact. Its story challenges assumptions about what makes history remembered. Monumental size, dramatic destruction, or literary documentation often dictate historical visibility. Quiet departures, subtle adaptations, and short-lived settlements can vanish almost entirely. Yet the settlement's impermanence does not diminish its significance. Vinland reveals human adaptability, courage, and ingenuity. It demonstrates the willingness to explore, to inhabit marginal lands, and to negotiate uncertainty in ways that leave faint but meaningful traces. It is a testament to small-scale resilience in the face of environmental, social, and logistical constraints. There is also a philosophical dimension to Vinland's story. By examining a settlement that left minimal impact on collective memory, we are forced to reconsider how we define historical significance. Is it the duration of occupation, the magnitude of structures, or is it the demonstration of human capability, the courage to confront uncertainty, and the small choices that shape survival? Vinland teaches that historical importance is not always measured by permanence. It is sometimes found in the very impermanence of human endeavor. Standing on the windswept coast today, one can imagine the Norse settlers' daily labor, hauling timber, maintaining shelters, hunting and fishing, observing seasonal patterns, and navigating both the natural environment and human relations with local populations. One can imagine their deliberations over whether to stay or leave, their awareness of isolation, and their recognition that life in Vinland, however promising, would never provide the security or continuity of Greenland. Their choice to leave reflects human pragmatism as much as courage, the ability to survive by knowing when to adapt, retreat, and preserve life over place. Vinland survives today as a memory in layers of soil, timbers, and artifacts, interpreted and reconstructed by archaeologists who piece together life from faint traces. Its absence in the historical record for centuries underscores the fragility of human memory. A settlement can be ambitious, sophisticated, and innovative, yet leave almost no mark on subsequent generations if it disappears quietly, without spectacle or permanent structures. And yet, the story persists in subtle ways. In the sagas, in material remnants, in the imagination of those who consider what it took to live on the margins of the known world. Vinland's quiet disappearance raises a final question that lingers like the Atlantic wind along its shores. If human effort, ingenuity, and courage can vanish almost entirely from historical memory, what is truly remembered? What counts as significance in the long sweep of history? In the end, Vinland reminds us that the value of human endeavor is not always in what survives, but in the choices, adaptations, and resilience demonstrated in the moment. It was a settlement at the edge of the world, lived fully and deliberately, yet quietly reclaimed by forest, wind, and time. Its legacy exists less in monuments or texts, and more in the lesson that history notices not only the extraordinary, but also the ephemeral, and that human ingenuity can endure even when human presence does not. Story 6. Skara Brae, the Forgotten Stone Village of Orkney. Imagine a windswept coastline on the Orkney Islands, off the northern tip of modern Scotland, roughly 5,000 years ago. The North Sea crashes against jagged cliffs, windswept grasses ripple across the land, and a small village sits snugly in a hollow, partially shielded from the worst of the elements. This is Skara Brae, a Neolithic settlement whose stones would preserve an entire way of life for millennia, yet whose story was forgotten until it was uncovered in the mid-19th century. Skara Brae was extraordinary, not because it was massive or ornate, but because it was complete, a village frozen in domestic detail, offering insight into the rhythms, structures, and routines of ordinary life. Composed of 8 clustered stone houses, each linked by covered passageways, the village was built with local flagstones, carefully fitted to create durable walls and furniture. Beds, cupboards, and hearths were carved from stone, while floors were paved, sometimes layered with clay, and doorways were deliberately low to reduce exposure to wind. Every aspect of the settlement reflected adaptation to the harsh northern environment and the ingenuity of its inhabitants. Life in Skara Brae was centered on survival, community, and continuity. Families were tightly knit, sharing labor and space in ways that modern observers might find cramped but highly functional. Each house contained multiple rooms for sleeping, storage, and daily work, with stone-built furniture embedded into the walls. Tools of bone, antler, and stone were used for cooking, fishing, and crafting. There were no monumental ceremonial structures. Instead, the focus was practical, domestic, and enduring. This attention to ordinary life is precisely what makes Skara Brae so compelling. It is a record of how people lived, worked, and organized their communities without the grandeur of palaces or temples. The village's location was both strategic and vulnerable. Built in a natural hollow near the coast, it had access to marine resources. Fish, shellfish, and sea mammals supplemented crops and livestock. Nearby fields, cleared of stones, supported barley, wheat, and domesticated animals such as cattle, sheep, and pigs. The inhabitants balanced the rich bounty of the sea with the uncertainties of agriculture in northern climates, demonstrating both resilience and foresight. Yet the very placement that provided protection from wind and access to resources also made the village susceptible to environmental change. Over time, shifting sands and powerful storms buried the settlement almost entirely, preserving it by accident and obscuring it from memory for thousands of years. The construction of Skara Brae reflects both ingenuity and long-term planning. Stone walls were built to withstand wind and moisture, passageways sheltered inhabitants from harsh weather, and storage pits allowed preservation of food through long winters. Hearths provided heat and a focal point for domestic life, while beds and cupboards were integrated into walls to maximize usable space. Every detail, from the orientation of doorways to the depth of floors, reflected careful observation of environmental conditions and the requirements of daily life. Material culture reveals a community highly skilled in resource management. Tools of bone, flint, and antler were abundant, indicating fishing, sewing, and food preparation. Ornaments suggest aesthetic sensibility and perhaps social differentiation, while pottery fragments demonstrate cooking, storage, and trade knowledge. Unlike larger urban centers, the village's complexity lay not in scale or monumental architecture, but in the detailed, practical design of everyday life, a society optimized for survival in a marginal environment. Skara Brae also offers a glimpse into social cohesion. Houses were uniform in design, suggesting shared knowledge and labor practices. Passageways connected homes, promoting interaction and collective work. Storage pits may have been communal, indicating systems of shared resources or collective oversight. The village's layout suggests that cooperation was not only cultural but essential. The environment demanded it, and survival depended on coordinated effort. Yet, for all its ingenuity, Skara Brae was vulnerable to forces beyond human control. Rising seas, shifting sands, and increasingly powerful storms eventually buried the village, removing it from sight and memory. Its abandonment was gradual and pragmatic, rather than dramatic. Residents may have relocated to higher ground or nearby areas, responding to environmental pressures that made continued occupation untenable. There is no evidence of catastrophic destruction. Instead, the site became silent, its story encoded in the very stones that had sheltered generations. The village remained largely forgotten for millennia, hidden beneath sand dunes until storms and excavation revealed its remarkable preservation. Unlike cities such as Helaik, which disappeared overnight, or Vinland, which faded quietly, Skara Brae was obscured by slow geological processes. Its rediscovery provided modern observers with an extraordinary insight into domestic Neolithic life, revealing that the history of ordinary people, what they ate, how they slept, how they organized households, can survive even when entire civilizations are otherwise lost to time. Standing among the partially reconstructed walls today, It is striking how the village communicates the rhythm of human life so long ago. One can imagine families tending fires, preparing food, crafting tools, and caring for children within the stone confines. It is a place of continuity, of resilience, and of adaptation, a microcosm of human ingenuity in a harsh and unforgiving environment. And yet questions linger. Why did the villagers leave? Was it gradual soil erosion, increasing storm activity, or some other environmental shift that made habitation untenable? How did their knowledge, skills, and culture transfer to other settlements, if at all? Skara Brae preserves objects and structures, but the people's experiences, decisions, and voices remain largely silent, leaving us to infer their lives from what they left behind. Skara Brae teaches a lesson that resonates across forgotten histories. Survival depends on adaptation, ingenuity, and community, but permanence is never guaranteed. Even the most well-built, carefully planned settlements are vulnerable to forces beyond human control. Yet these seemingly ordinary lives, preserved in stone and sand, offer profound insight into human resilience and the subtle ways societies manage the environment, resources, and social cohesion. And as you look at the stone beds, built-in cupboards, and carefully arranged hearths, one thought remains. Even when a society disappears from collective memory, its daily rhythms, its strategies for survival, and its ingenuity can speak across millennia, leaving behind lessons in resilience and adaptation that modern observers can still decipher. By the time Skara Brae was fully inhabited, daily life had developed a rhythm that was intimately tied to both the environment and the structure of the village itself. Families awoke to the biting cold of northern mornings, and the first task was often to stoke the hearth. Heat was precious in these damp, wind-lashed homes, and maintaining fires was not just a matter of comfort, it was a matter of survival. Fuel came from driftwood, turf, and sometimes peat, carefully rationed and supplemented by forest and coastal resources. The flickering light of the fire illuminated rooms that were otherwise dim, revealing stone beds, built-in cupboards, and tools of bone and flint, each meticulously arranged to maximize utility in the small spaces. Cooking, cleaning, and preparation of food occupied a substantial portion of daily labor. Residents relied on a combination of domesticated animals, cultivated crops, and gathered or hunted resources. Sheep, cattle, and pigs provided meat, milk, and hides, while barley and wheat offered essential staples. Fish, shellfish, and sea birds were critical supplements, particularly during lean periods or when livestock productivity was low. Food processing was labor-intensive. Grain had to be ground into flour, meats salted or smoked, and dairy preserved through fermentation or careful storage. Even simple meals required coordination, skill, and ongoing attention. The village's layout reveals much about the division of labor. Each house was compact but functionally complete: a sleeping area, a central hearth, storage spaces, and work surfaces integrated into walls. Stone-built dressers or cupboards held tools, cooking implements, and personal items. Beds were low and often lined with clay or animal hides to provide insulation. Such design reflects an intimate knowledge of environmental challenges, ergonomics, and domestic efficiency. Every stone was positioned with purpose, reflecting a community adept at optimizing small, harsh spaces for both survival and comfort. Social cohesion was essential. Skara Brae was not merely a cluster of individual houses, it was a connected village. Covered passageways linked homes, facilitating communication, shared labor, and communal activities. Children and adults alike would have interacted frequently, exchanging knowledge, assisting with chores, and participating in joint projects. This arrangement fostered collaboration, but also required negotiation. Privacy was limited, and conflict resolution would have been an ongoing, practical necessity. The village's survival depended on cooperation, and the architecture itself encouraged it. Crafting and tool maintenance were critical aspects of life. Bone, antler, and flint were used to create knives, needles, fishhooks, and other tools. Artisanship was practical but skilled. Knives had to be sharp, needles durable, and fish hooks carefully shaped to capture local species. Tools wore down quickly, especially in a maritime and agrarian environment, so repair and replacement were continuous tasks. Even aesthetic choices, engraved bone, carefully shaped ornaments suggest that beauty and utility were intertwined, and that cultural expression was embedded in daily labor rather than monumental structures. Seasonal cycles dictated activity and survival strategy. Summers were intense, involving field work, building maintenance, hunting, and fishing. The milder months allowed families to repair homes, process harvested crops, and prepare for the long, dark winter. Winters required rationing, careful management of firewood, and reliance on preserved foods. The village's residents had to anticipate environmental challenges months in advance, storing sufficient grain, meat, and fuel to endure periods when outside resources were inaccessible. Planning, foresight, and communal cooperation were as vital as physical labor. Interactions with the natural world were constant and multifaceted. The North Sea provided fish and marine mammals, but also posed dangers. Storms, strong tides, and frigid waters demanded respect and skill. Inland, foraging and hunting required knowledge of animal behavior, seasonal patterns, and terrain. Crops and livestock demanded consistent care, requiring settlers to understand soil conditions, rainfall patterns, and animal health. Every day was a negotiation with the environment, a careful balancing act between opportunity and risk. Education and knowledge transfer occurred informally but rigorously. Children learned practical skills: crafting, hunting, farming, and animal husbandry from elders, often through direct participation. They absorbed social norms, survival strategies, and environmental awareness by observing and assisting adults. This experiential learning ensured continuity, passing critical survival knowledge across generations and embedding cultural practices in everyday action rather than formalized instruction. Yet even as life thrived within these stone walls, vulnerability was never far from mind. Rising seas, storms, and gradual coastal erosion threatened the village's long-term viability. These pressures likely influenced decisions regarding relocation or eventual abandonment. Unlike urban civilizations where monumental architecture dominates memory, Skara Bray's subtlety, its integration into the landscape, made it highly susceptible to slow geological and environmental forces. Preservation depended less on deliberate construction for posterity, and more on the fortuitous covering of sand and debris that would protect it long after abandonment. Archaeological evidence reinforces the sense of structured, adaptive life. Hearths show layers of soot and ash accumulated over years, indicating frequent use and maintenance. Storage pits contain charred grain and shells, hinting at both resource management and dietary variety. Tools and ornaments reveal the interplay of practicality and culture. Every crafted object reflects human intention, skill, and adaptation. Even waste deposits provide insight into consumption patterns, environmental awareness, and social habits. Life at Skara Bray was ordinary yet highly organized, a balance of labor, domesticity, and survival, finely tuned to environmental realities. And yet questions persist. Why did the inhabitants leave, abandoning a village so carefully adapted to its surroundings? Was it the cumulative impact of environmental change, rising seas, or increasingly harsh winters? Did social structures fracture under stress? Or did communities simply decide that relocation offered better long-term survival? These questions remain unresolved because human experience is rarely fully captured in stone and artifacts alone. Skara Bray preserves materiality brilliantly, but the emotional, psychological, and social nuances of life are largely silent. Still, the village offers profound lessons about human resilience. Its architecture, tools, and layout demonstrate careful planning, community cohesion, and adaptive intelligence. It reminds us that survival in marginal environments relies on cooperation, foresight, and an intimate understanding of the natural world. And it underscores a subtle truth of history. Not all significant human achievements are monumental or widely remembered. Sometimes, the quiet labor of ordinary lives crafted with precision and ingenuity speaks across millennia more profoundly than the most dramatic conquests or disasters. As you imagine life in Skara Brae, stoking the hearth, preparing meals, crafting tools, and interacting with neighbors, one thought lingers. The people who lived here were deeply ordinary, yet extraordinary in their ability to adapt, cooperate, and endure. Their disappearance was gradual, their story obscured by time and sand, yet the legacy of their daily labor endures, waiting to be deciphered and appreciated. By the time Skara Brae was finally abandoned, perhaps around 2500 BCE, the village had already endured centuries of harsh northern weather, adapting to the rhythms of life on the Orkney coast. The people who lived there were no strangers to challenge. Winds that cut like knives, rain that saturated sod floors, and storms that battered the coastline demanded resilience and ingenuity. Yet for generations, they persisted, crafting homes, tools, and social structures that allowed survival in one of Europe's most marginal environments. The abandonment of the village appears to have been gradual. Archaeological evidence suggests no catastrophic collapse or invasion. Rather, environmental pressures, rising sea levels, encroaching sand, and shifting soils likely made continued habitation increasingly difficult. Families may have relocated to higher ground or to other settlements, taking knowledge and skills with them. Life moved on, and Skara Brae fell silent, buried by sand and time, leaving a ghostly imprint of everyday life. Despite its disappearance, Skara Brae remains extraordinary in the historical record. The village provides an unparalleled window into Neolithic domestic life, the organization of space, the division of labor, and the routines of ordinary people. Each house, passageway, and piece of built-in furniture tells a story of adaptation and problem-solving. The low stone beds, carefully constructed hearths, and built-in storage units reveal inhabitants who understood their environment intimately and planned for survival over decades. This was a community not of kings or warriors, but of ordinary people whose labor and ingenuity shaped every moment of life. Tools and artifacts amplify this understanding. Bone needles, antler combs, flint knives, and pottery fragments demonstrate skilled craftsmanship, efficient use of local resources, and attention to detail. Even seemingly mundane objects like carefully shaped stone weights or storage vessels offer insight into social norms, domestic priorities, and everyday decision-making. These people were practical, observant, and creative, embedding culture and knowledge into objects that endured long after their creators disappeared. The village's design also highlights social cohesion and interdependence. Covered passageways linked homes, allowing for communal interaction and facilitating shared labor. Storage pits may have served collective purposes, suggesting that resource management was coordinated among households. The uniformity of house design indicates a shared knowledge base and similar lifestyle expectations, fostering cohesion in a small but intricate society. Cooperation was not optional, it was essential for survival. Yet, for all its ingenuity, Skara Brae was vulnerable to slow but relentless forces. Rising seas gradually undermined fields and foundations, and shifting sand threatened both stability and habitability. Unlike dramatic disasters that leave striking ruins, Skara Brae's disappearance was subtle, marked by gradual environmental encroachment. Its survival in the historical record depended on chance storms exposing the buried settlement centuries later, preserving walls, furniture, and artifacts that otherwise might have been lost entirely. Skara Brae's rediscovery in the 19th century reminds us that historical memory is selective. Societies can leave behind extensive labor, skill, and knowledge, yet vanish quietly, unnoticed by subsequent generations. its obscurity until excavation underscores how much history relies on both preservation and observation. Ordinary lives, no less than monumental events, can provide profound insight into human resilience, ingenuity, and adaptation, but only if traces survive and someone notices them. In reflecting on Skara Brae, one sees the delicate balance between permanence and impermanence in human endeavor. The village was durable in design and thoughtful in planning, yet it was ultimately at the mercy of natural forces and the slow erosion of time. Its stones endure, but the people themselves are lost. What survives is not the narrative of individual lives, but the imprint of adaptation, labor, and communal decision-making. From these traces, modern observers can reconstruct a history of ordinary humans navigating extraordinary challenges. Skara Brae also demonstrates the universality of human problem-solving. Across continents and millennia, communities have faced environmental pressures and social constraints, from Akrotiri buried in volcanic ash to Vinland on the edge of the known world. Each society developed strategies to survive, thrive, and organize daily life in ways attuned to local conditions. Skara Brae's brilliance lies not in conquest or wealth, but in the careful structuring of ordinary life in alignment with environment, resources, and social cohesion, a model of resilience that resonates across time. Yet, as we study Skara Brae, we confront the limits of what material culture can reveal. Stone walls and built-in beds tell us about construction, storage, and household labor, but they cannot convey emotion, belief, or memory. The rhythms of laughter, conflict, care, and celebration remain largely invisible, leaving us to infer human experience from traces alone. Skara Brae preserves structure and survival, but much of its humanity remains silent, waiting for interpretation. In the end, the village speaks in subtle but persistent ways. Its stones, artifacts, and passageways communicate lessons about adaptation, cooperation, and resilience in the face of environmental uncertainty. They remind us that history is not only about empires, wars, or monumental achievements, it is also about the quiet, sustained labor of ordinary lives. Skara Brae endures as a monument to practical intelligence, communal coordination, and human creativity, preserved in sand and stone, whispering across millennia. And as you leave the hallowed village, one thought lingers. Civilizations may vanish, lives may be lost to memory, and settlements may disappear beneath sand, ash, or forest. Yet the strategies,